Welcome back to our final look at the structure of the BMAT essay. We've previously looked at the explanation before moving on to look at how to argue to the contrary, and in our previous video looking at how to tackle the to what extent paragraph. If any of these are unfamiliar to you, please check back through the video post to familiarise yourself. Anyway, in this video we will be putting it all together and tackle a further past BMAT question, picking out key points as we go along. This question concerns potential ethical questions that practicing vets might face. We're given an assertion that a pet belongs to its owner, and having been given the concepts belonging and ownership, we're invited to accept that the pet is the property of the owner. There is then a thus, which is asking us to draw an inference from the previous assertion that a healthy cat can be destroyed if the owner so wishes, and vets should always comply with such requests if made by the owner. Okay, so that's the context for the rubric. We're then asked to cover a number of functions in the writing of our response, and none of these should come as a surprise as they are highly formulaic, and we start off with the request for a plausible explanation of the statement, and then a request to argue against that normative element. That is, we should try and represent a counter-argument that opens the door to empowering the vet in such circumstances and slams it shut in the face of the owner and their wishes. As ever, we end up by stating how we feel about the issue, and here specifically we should try to present and justify a delimiting of pet owners' sway over vets' decisions. Right, let's start with their explanation, which, if you remember, is a plausible representation of the reasoning behind, or possibly behind, the statement. Now, here's a formulaic beginning that we might want to use in such an essay, and if you remember this, you can then dive from this into the statement of a principle that you feel the argument will launch from. What do we mean by a principle? Well, it's the foundational belief that you can't go back further from. That is, if I asked you, why do you believe it? You wouldn't be able to provide a reason, other than perhaps just to say, well, that's just what property is. Another example of a principle might be that all life is sacred, which is used in the abortion debate. It makes nonsense to ask why here. Okay, so we can see the benefit of this opening lead-in as it prepares us for our principle, which here is that thing which belongs to a person is their property. This is tying together a state, in this case of belonging, and partially unpacking it to find a possible legal position. And once we've got the idea of property derived from something belonging to someone, we can then look at the something, and thankfully in these more enlightened days, free of legalised slavery, as persons cannot be another's property, we might presume that pets, being non-persons, can be. So we get pets as belonging to an owner, are property of a type, and that is a thing. And we can create a line of reasoning from this and state that a pet being a thing and an owner's property, the owner is within their rights to do with it as they will. Of course, we can think of examples where this is not the case, like destroying your own house if it's in a terrace, but we only need to provide a plausible explanation, not a watertight one. If we can do whatever we want with our own property, we can destroy it, and the vet or another would have no right to intervene. Now, this reasoning links directly back to the question and explains why the owner should be given freedom to so act. But it's an inference out of that freedom that the vet should be obligated in consideration of duty to his client to agree. Clearly, here we can see that although there is something by way of explanation of the proposition, an explanation of the rights of the owner over their property are being extended to the professional service And this just isn't reasonable. But that's something that we can look at in our remaining paragraphs. Anyway, our next task is to argue to the contrary. Now this shouldn't be so tricky, given that we've just said regarding the limits of an owner's rights over their property. Now remember that in our previous video we looked at the difference between rebuttal, that looks to knock down the reasoning used in the explanation, and counter-argument, that looks to provide new, separate lines of reasoning to attack the proposition. Once again, we have a standard phrase as a starter. This is useful as we can see from the language used here. There are those who argue to the contrary. That the preposition is that this argument will be a different one from the explanation. But also, because we are stating those, we can see that it will be a different argument from that which will be my argument in the following paragraph. Here we start with a principle, once more, to ground our argument, and that is that one should always act within the law. And from that we can build a line of reasoning that with regards to animals in their care, owners are legally obliged to look after their best interests, and killing them, whilst they still have the capacity for a full and healthy life, is not acting in the animal's best interests. And if a vet went along with such a request, they would not be a vet for very long, as they would face prosecution and probable loss of livelihood. So, to relate back to the question, there is therefore sufficient reason to believe that the vet should never agree to a request like this. And here's the paragraph written out. Each stage is explicit and in logical order. Having considered arguments as to whether a vet should always comply or always refuse an owner's request to euthanize a healthy cat, we're asked to consider a lesser claim. Here, in our final paragraph, we must be careful to take our time to read the wording. In this example, this is because we're not being asked to what extent do you agree that a vet should comply with an owner's request to euthanize their healthy pet. That would be to read the explanation as what the proposition means, arguing to the contrary as to what an opponent might mean, and to what extent as to what I mean. Now, reading the question carefully, we see that we are asked about the extent of influence generally. So once again, we can start from a principle that we do not need to provide reasons for. And here, that principle might be that animals are capable of suffering. And from this, we can reason that if they can do little about it, it's beholden on the owner to do so, that is, to lessen that suffering. Now we can start exploring the extent that the question asks. The owner needs to look after their pet and take decisions for it, but the vet, although subject to the owner's wishes generally, where they see maltreatment, is able to override such wishes in the best interests of the animal. As such, the wishes of the owner have persuasive force, but are not a necessary condition for the vet acting, to the extent that if the owner doesn't wish an action, the vet cannot take it. No, so that's one view from the vet's angle, in that he doesn't need the owner's express permission in every circumstance, and here we're talking about maltreatment. But also, looking at it from the owner's point of view, the possibility of maltreatment means that just because the owner wants an action carried out, it doesn't follow that the vet must comply with that. So, the owner's wishes are not sufficient to oblige a vet to so act. So, the extent of influence of an owner is highly persuasive, given their primary interest to act in the best interests of the animal. But where there is clear evidence that they have not and do not intend to act in the best interests, the vet is not obliged to take their wishes into account, and their influence is negligible. Thus we have shown the extent of influence and its criterion. And that's how it looks written up. The whole essay can be seen here, and from this you can see that the paragraphs get longer, and this is to be expected as our final paragraph will state our own position on the matter and will need the most exposition. I hope you can see that in all paragraphs we are trying to argue from principles as a base. Once we've set that up, we can create a line of reasoning from it to our desired conclusion. I hope this short run through of a question response has been of some value to you, along with the previous videos on the explanation paragraph, argument to the contrary paragraph, and to what extent paragraph. If you have any questions regarding any of the material in these short vids or the BMAT essay structure in general, please feel free to contact me at thecriticalwritingbureau.com. Thank you for listening.